In the summer of 1941, as the German war machine thundered across the Soviet frontier, millions of soldiers were thrown into a desperate struggle for survival. The Soviet Union, unprepared for the scale and speed of the invasion, found itself on the brink of collapse. Entire divisions vanished in days. Cities burned, and the Red Army retreated under relentless fire. But for those who were captured, another nightmare began, one that came not from their enemy, but from their own leader. Joseph Stalin, the man who ruled the USA with an iron fist, issued one of the most chilling orders in wartime history. Order No. 270. It declared that any Soviet soldier who surrendered was not a victim, but a traitor. Their families, wives, parents, children would be punished as if they had betrayed the motherland themselves. There would be no mercy, no understanding of the chaos on the battlefield. To Stalin, loyalty was absolute or non-existent. Imagine being a young soldier, surrounded by enemy tanks, ammunition gone, comrades dead or wounded, and knowing that if you surrender, your family could pay the price. Stalin's decree turned survival into guilt, courage into suspicion, and fear into a weapon of control. Across the front lines, Soviet soldiers faced an impossible choice: die fighting or live branded forever as traitors. This story is not just about war, it is about power, paranoia, and the crushing weight of ideology on human lives. It is a glimpse into how one man's obsession with control shaped the fate of millions, how fear replaced faith, and how loyalty was demanded even in the face of hopelessness. In today's episode, we will uncover the truth behind Stalin's infamous order, what led him to make it, how it affected soldiers and their families, and what it reveals about the brutal reality of life in the Soviet Union during World War I. We will also explore the human stories buried beneath the propaganda, those who defied, obeyed, and suffered in silence. If you are fascinated by the hidden sides of history, by the untold stories of courage and cruelty that shaped our world, you are in the right place. Do not forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell, so you won't miss the next chapter in our journey through the past. History is not just a collection of dates and battles, it is a mirror showing what power, fear, and belief can do to people. And sometimes, as in Stalin's Soviet Union, that mirror reflects the darkest depths of human ambition. The first months after Stalin's decree were a descent into chaos and disbelief. On paper, Order No. 270 was meant to restore discipline and courage within the Red Army. In reality, it collided head-on with the brutal truth of the battlefield. As German panzer divisions sliced through Soviet lines, entire armies were swallowed by encirclement. The speed of the German advance defied comprehension. Villages that had been Soviet territory at dawn were in enemy hands by dusk. Communication collapsed. Railways were destroyed. And the Red Army, still reeling from Stalin's earlier purges of its officers, struggled to act with any coordination. For the ordinary soldier, the front became a landscape of terror and confusion. Some units fought until their ammunition was gone, surrounded on all sides, with no word from command. Others found themselves cut off in forests or marshes, forced to move at night to avoid aircraft. The summer heat brought clouds of dust that clung to skin and lungs, while the smell of burning machines and bodies filled the air. Men who had trained to defend their homeland suddenly faced the impossible reality that survival itself could be considered treason. When the encirclements began, first at Smolensk, then later at Kiev, the scale of the disaster grew beyond imagination. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers vanished into German captivity, some surrendering only after they had exhausted every bullet, others dragged into surrender by sheer starvation. But for those captured, the nightmare was only beginning. Stalin's order ensured that even in defeat, there would be no compassion waiting for them back home. Their names were struck from military records, their families labeled relatives of traitors, and in some cases expelled from their homes or sent to labor camps. Mothers wept in silence, knowing their sons were alive somewhere but forbidden to mourn them publicly. Among the soldiers still in the field, rumors of this punishment spread like wildfire. The effect was devastating. Men began to view capture not as a possibility, but as a moral death sentence. Some, cornered by advancing Germans, chose to destroy their own weapons and take their lives rather than face the shame of surrender. Others attempted daring breakouts, slipping through enemy lines at night, crawling through fields of mud and barbed wire to rejoin the fight. The front became littered with these acts of desperate courage, driven less by faith in victory than by fear of being branded a traitor. Commanders, too, were trapped in the same impossible dilemma. Those who retreated to preserve their troops risked being court-martialed. Those who obeyed orders to hold at all costs often saw their units annihilated. Reports reached Moscow of entire regiments refusing to retreat even when surrounded, choosing annihilation over accusation. Stalin's demand for absolute loyalty had turned courage into a death trap. Meanwhile, the German advance appeared unstoppable. Armored columns swept eastward, devouring territory at a rate no one had seen before. They captured cities like Minsk and Smolensk with terrifying speed, and tens of thousands of Soviet soldiers fell into captivity with each new encirclement. But as the Germans pushed deeper, their success came at a cost. Every kilometer gained stretched their supply lines thinner, every captured soldier required guards, and every victory pushed them further into the vastness of the Soviet land. For those trapped behind the lines, the landscape itself became an enemy. The retreating Soviet forces burned crops and destroyed bridges to deny resources to the Germans, leaving little for their own soldiers to survive on. Hunger became a constant companion, and frost began to creep into the nights as autumn approached. Yet through all of this, the spirit of defiance began to harden. Stalin's harsh decree, intended to enforce discipline, had inadvertently bred a strange kind of resilience, a grim determination among soldiers who believed that to live at all, they must fight without end. In countless letters home, many of which never reached their destinations, Soviet soldiers wrote not of ideology or politics, but of longing and guilt. They begged forgiveness from families they feared they had already shamed. Some confessed their terror of being captured. Others swore they would rather die in battle. Their words were filled with the quiet despair of men who understood that survival might not bring them home as heroes, but as ghosts condemned by their own country. Behind them, in Moscow, Stalin refused to accept reports of defeat. He saw encirclements not as the consequence of poor planning, but as proof of betrayal. Generals who lost battles were accused of cowardice. Officers who surrendered were condemned in absentia. The paranoia that had already destroyed the Soviet officer corps in the purges now reached the battlefield itself. Trust vanished. Fear ruled. Yet, out of this chaos, something began to change. The brutality of the German invasion, combined with Stalin's merciless policies, forged a desperate unity among those who remained. Soldiers who once distrusted their commanders began to fight not for Stalin, but for each other, for survival, for revenge, for the faint hope of reclaiming what had been lost. They fought knowing that retreat meant death, and surrender meant disgrace. But within that grim certainty, a new kind of defiance took shape. By the time the first snows fell, the Soviet Union was bloody beyond recognition. Millions were dead or missing. Entire armies had been erased from the maps. But beneath the ruins, a flicker of resistance endured. Those who survived the encirclements carried with them the memory of betrayal and loss, but also the realization that they were fighting not just an invading army, but the crushing weight of history itself. Stalin's order had turned the Red Army into an army without forgiveness, but it also created men who no longer feared death, only dishonor. In that grim transformation lay both the tragedy and the strength of the Soviet war effort, a nation held together not by mercy, but by the unyielding will to endure when every human instinct begged to surrender. As the Red Army struggled to survive the inferno of 1941, the Germans seemed poised to deliver the final blow. Their armies had pushed deep into Soviet territory, capturing vast regions and encircling hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops. To the soldiers on the ground, it appeared that the fall of Moscow was only a matter of time. The German generals, men like Heinz Guderian, Friedrich von Bock, and Franz Halder believed that striking at the Soviet capital would shatter the enemy's will to fight. They saw Moscow as the heart of the Soviet machine, the center of communications, transport, and command. If it fell, they reasoned, the Soviet Union itself might crumble. But far from the front lines, inside Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia, the Führer's vision of the war began to drift from his generals' logic. He had grown increasingly distrustful of their advice, convinced that they did not grasp his broader political and economic ambitions. To Hitler, the war was not only about destroying armies, but about seizing the resources that would feed his empire for generations. The fertile lands of Ukraine, the coal mines of the Donbas, the oil fields of the Caucasus, these, he believed, were the true prizes of the campaign. In late July 1941, as German troops stood just a few hundred kilometers from Moscow, Hitler made a decision that would alter the course of the entire war. He ordered the main thrust of his army to turn south, toward Kiev and the Ukrainian heartland. To his generals, it was a shocking move, one that defied every principle of strategy they had followed since the invasion began. Guderian and others protested, arguing that diverting the advance would squander the momentum that had carried them so far. But Hitler would not be swayed. He wanted the rich farmlands, the industrial centers, and above all, the vast grain and oil reserves that would sustain his war effort. The consequences of that decision rippled across the front. German divisions that had been driving toward Moscow suddenly found themselves ordered to swing south, joining the attack on the encircled Soviet forces near Kiev. The maneuver was massive and complex, involving hundreds of thousands of troops and thousands of vehicles moving through roads already clogged with dust and refugees. For weeks, the advance toward Moscow stalled, giving the Red Army something it had not had since the invasion began. Time. While Hitler's generals obeyed his orders, their frustration grew. They knew the delay would be costly. Every passing day brought shorter daylight, worsening weather, and colder nights. Supply lines that already strained under the vast distances of the Soviet Union became even more overextended. Trucks broke down, fuel ran short, and horses collapsed from exhaustion. The German army, once a model of speed and precision, began to lose its rhythm. Yet the battle for Kiev became one of the largest encirclements in history. By September, the Germans trapped nearly 700,000 Soviet soldiers, annihilating entire Soviet armies and taking control of much of Ukraine. To Hitler, it was proof that his instincts were correct. He celebrated it as a triumph that would secure the resources needed for victory. But for his generals, the success felt hollow. They understood that the delay had drained the Wehrmacht's strength and robbed them of the opportunity to strike Moscow before the onset of winter. As the southern battles raged, the Red Army used those crucial weeks to regroup. New divisions were raised deep in the interior, far from the front, and reinforcements began to flow toward Moscow. Factories, hastily dismantled from cities threatened by German advance, were reassembled beyond the Urals, continuing to produce weapons and ammunition. What had seemed like the final collapse of the Soviet Union now began to look like a slow, stubborn recovery. By the time Hitler turned his attention back to Moscow in October, the opportunity for a decisive blow was gone. The roads had turned to mud, slowing every movement to a crawl. The soldiers who had marched across Europe now found themselves wading through endless stretches of rain and cold. Their boots heavy, their vehicles stuck. Supplies that were meant to last weeks were consumed in days. And morale began to crumble. The once invincible blitzkrieg, the lightning war, had dimmed into a slow, grinding struggle against distance and weather. Inside German headquarters, tempers flared. The generals blamed Hitler's obsession with the South for the delays. They saw Moscow slipping away, not because of Soviet resistance, but because of decisions made far from the battlefield. Hitler, however, saw the situation differently. He remained convinced that Moscow was only a symbol, not the true key to victory. He believed that capturing Ukraine's harvest and the industrial riches of the East would cripple the Soviets far more effectively than taking their capital. In his, the war would be won not by speed, but by possession, by holding the lands that would feed his empire. But history would prove otherwise. The loss of time could not be reclaimed. When the Germans finally resumed their march toward Moscow in late autumn, they did so against an enemy that was no longer collapsing, but preparing to stand and fight. The Red Army, once shattered, now fought with desperate determination. Soviet engineers built fortifications around Moscow, civilians dug trenches, and reinforcements poured in from Siberia. What awaited the Germans was not a broken enemy, but a nation awakened by the threat of annihilation. As winter descended, the consequences of Hitler's decision became painfully clear. Tanks froze in place, soldiers wrapped themselves in scavenged blankets, and frostbite claimed more men than bullets. The Wehrmacht, which had seemed unstoppable just months before, now found itself halted before the gates of Moscow. The chance to end the war in 1941 had vanished into the snow. In the quiet of those frozen nights, some German officers admitted what they dared not say aloud, that the war had turned. The detour to Ukraine had brought victory on paper, but defeat in spirit. Hitler's hunger for resources had blinded him to the truth that wars are not won by territory alone, but by timing, endurance, and the will of those who refuse to surrender. And as the fires burned on the horizon of Moscow, that will was beginning to reveal itself in the soldiers of the Red Army, men who had been condemned by their leader, yet fought with a ferocity no order could extinguish. The momentum that had once carried the German army across Europe began to falter as the reality of the Eastern Front revealed its brutal nature. After months of rapid victories and sweeping encirclements, the war that had seemed destined for quick success was now turning into a test of endurance. What the generals had once praised as the greatest campaign in modern warfare was slowly unraveling under the sheer weight of geography, weather, and exhaustion. The Soviet Union was not France or Poland. It was a vast and endless expanse where every mile consumed more than it gave back. The land itself seemed to rise up against the invaders. By the time the order came to resume the advance toward Moscow in the autumn of 1941, the German army was no longer the well-oiled machine it had been in June. Supply lines stretched across thousands of kilometers, winding through terrain that seemed to swallow everything: fuel, food, ammunition, and men. The railways that were meant to carry supplies eastward had been destroyed by retreating Soviet forces, their bridges blown apart, their stations burned. The Germans tried to repair them, but the tracks were of a different gauge than those used in the West, forcing endless delays. Trucks were overworked, their engines clogged with dust and mud, their tires shredded from constant use. Horses, once relied upon to pull artillery and wagons, collapsed in their harnesses, dying on the roadside in the thousands. What had begun as a lightning war now depended on convoys that crawled forward at a walking pace. Each kilometer gained demanded gallons of fuel that could no longer be delivered in time. Soldiers at the front rationed their food, chewing hard bread and cold meat when they could get it. sometimes going days without a proper meal. Ammunition shipments failed to arrive, leaving artillery crews to count their remaining shells carefully, unsure when the next delivery would come. The brilliant synchronization that had defined the early blitzkrieg, the perfect coordination between tanks, infantry, and aircraft was breaking down under the sheer scale of the invasion. As the days shortened and the temperature dropped, the roads turned into a nightmare. What had been dusty tracks in summer became rivers of mud in autumn. Vehicles sank axle deep, and entire columns came to a halt, immobilized by the mire. Soldiers tried to drag trucks free with ropes or wooden planks. Their boots sucked into the muck, their strength sapped by exhaustion. Even horses, once able to find footing on rough ground, slipped and broke their legs. The famed German efficiency began to crumble, not because of poor planning, but because nature itself offered no mercy. Communication, too, began to fail. Telephone lines were cut by partisans, radio functioned in the cold, and entire divisions found themselves operating without clear orders. Commanders at headquarters struggled to understand what was happening at the front. Reports arrived late or not at all, distorted by confusion or wishful thinking. Maps became unreliable. Villages were misidentified. Roads disappeared under snow or mud, and supply pots were lost in the chaos. The once unified front dissolved into a scattered network of isolated units, each fighting its own battle against both the enemy and the land. The deeper the Germans pushed, the more the land turned alien. Forests stretched endlessly, and the horizon offered no sense of progress. The countryside was empty, its people evacuated or dead, its wells poisoned, its fields burned by retreating Soviet forces. The policy of scorched earth left nothing for the invaders to live on. Soldiers scavenged for food in abandoned homes, sometimes finding only jars of pickled vegetables or sacks of spoiled grain. The nights grew colder, and frost began to creep into the air, freezing the mud into jagged crusts that cut into their hands. Fuel shortages meant that vehicles could not always be kept running, and without the warmth of engines, entire regiments shivered through the nights in thin uniforms, lighting small fires when they dared. Among the officers, frustration gave way to quiet despair. They had been trained to believe that discipline and will could overcome any obstacle. But now they faced a foe that could not be fought with weapons. The distances grew longer, the resources fewer, and still the orders came from above. Advance. Push forward. Capture Moscow. Every kilometer brought greater losses, not just in men, but in morale. Soldiers began to understand that the promises of quick victory were gone. The enemy did not collapse as expected. The Soviet forces, though battered and bloodied, fought with renewed fury. They had learned from their defeats, and now they struck at the German supply lines, ambushing convoys, burning fuel depots, cutting off stragglers. In villages behind the front, field hospitals filled with frostbitten men, their bodies broken not by bullets but by the cold. Mechanics worked in the open air, their tools freezing to their fingers, repairing engines that would soon fail again. The Luftwaffe, once dominant in the skies, found itself grounded by fog and snow, its planes unable to operate effectively. The German advance slowed to a crawl, not because of resistance alone, but because their own strength was bleeding away into the mud and ice of the Russian landscape. When October turned to November, the frost hardened the earth, making it easier for tanks to move but harder for men to survive. The soldiers wrapped themselves in whatever they could find: sacks, blankets, torn coats, anything to keep out the biting cold. The supply trains lagged behind, still hundreds of kilometers away, delayed by broken tracks and ambushes. Rations grew smaller, ammunition grew scarcer, fuel became a treasure worth fighting over. Every fire, every cigarette, every sip of warm soup became a moment of grace in a world of relentless hardship. And yet, despite the suffering, The order from the top remained unchanged. Moscow must fall. Hitler refused to accept the reality his generals now saw clearly. The vastness of the Soviet Union had swallowed his armies, stretching them to their breaking point. The same ambition that had driven him to seek glory in the East was now devouring his forces mile by mile. The soldiers who had once believed in unstoppable victory now trudged through snow and silence, their breath freezing in the air, wondering how a campaign that began with thunder had descended into this endless, frozen struggle. The supply lines that were meant to carry triumph had instead become lifelines stretched to the point of breaking. And as the German army advanced toward a distant horizon that never seemed to come closer, the war was quietly shifting, no longer a battle of maneuver, but a war of survival, fought against an enemy that would not yield and a landscape that would not forgive. While the German army struggled through the mud and snow, the Soviet Union was reshaping itself in the furnace of war. The first months of the invasion had brought humiliation and despair. Entire armies had been wiped out, cities lost, and millions of soldiers captured or killed. Yet beneath the ruins, something extraordinary began to happen. What the Germans saw as the final collapse of the Soviet state was, in reality, the beginning of its rebirth. The chaos that had engulfed the Red Army in the summer of 1941 was slowly giving way to an immense, disciplined effort of reconstruction on a scale no other nation had ever attempted. Across the vastness of the Soviet Union, factories were dismantled, loaded onto trains, and sent thousands of kilometers eastward, beyond the reach of German bombers. In towns and villages from the Urals to Siberia, new workshops appeared almost overnight, filled with women, teenagers, and the elderly, anyone who could weld, hammer, or assemble the tools of war. The sound of machinery replaced the silence of loss. Every hour, day and night, weapons, uniforms, and supplies rolled out of these makeshift plants, feeding an army that refused to die. Stalin's government called this the Great Patriotic War, and in that phrase lay a purpose that transcended politics or fear. It was not just a fight for territory, but a struggle for existence itself. The Red Army that faced the Germans in the autumn of 1941 was not the same one that had been crushed months earlier. It was an army reborn in desperation and forged in sacrifice. From every corner of the Soviet Union came a flood of new recruits, peasants, factory workers, students, and even convicts. Many had never seen a battlefield before. Some had never fired a rifle. But they came willingly, driven by a mixture of fear, duty, and pride. Propaganda posters promised revenge. Radio broadcasts invoked the names of heroes from Russia's past. Families sent their sons with tears and blessings, knowing many would not return, but believing that every sacrifice was a thread in the defense of their homeland. Training was rushed, weapons were scarce, and equipment was often improvised. New divisions were thrown together with barely enough rifles to arm every man. Sometimes, two soldiers shared one weapon, one to fire, the other to wait until the first fell. Yet what they lacked in preparation, they compensated for with a burning determination. Commanders spoke of recruits who marched barefoot through snow, of women who carried ammunition on their backs, of engineers who built bridges under enemy fire. The Soviet system, brutal and unyielding, demanded total commitment, and the people gave it. As the German forces pushed deeper into the heart of Russia, they began to encounter resistance that defied logic. The Red Army, once scattered and broken, now stood in their way with fresh ranks that seemed endless. New formations appeared where none had existed before. When one unit was destroyed, another took its place, drawn from reserves that seemed inexhaustible. The Germans, accustomed to swift victories, began to realize they were fighting not just an army but an entire nation in arms. By late autumn, Soviet counterattacks began to appear along the vast front. At first, they were clumsy, Ill-coordinated efforts, poorly supplied troops charging into well-defended positions, but even these desperate assaults had an effect. They forced the Germans to pause, to divert strength, to fight for every village and riverbank. The momentum of the blitzkrieg was gone. What replaced it was a grinding war of attrition, one that favored the side with more men, more space, and more will to endure. And in all three, the Soviet Union had the advantage. Behind the front lines, Soviet officers were learning from every failure. The chaos of June and July had exposed the weaknesses of their command system, but now new leaders were rising, men like Zhukov, Rokossovsky, and Konev, commanders who understood how to fight this new kind of war. They reorganized defenses, built fortified lines, and coordinated attacks with increasing precision. Stalin, who had once interfered in every decision, began to listen grudgingly to his generals. The transformation was slow and costly, but it was happening. Even the soldiers themselves were changing. The fear that had once paralyzed them began to harden into defiance. They learned to use the terrain to their advantage, to ambush rather than confront, to adapt to the enemy's tactics. The sight of German tanks no longer brought panic but grim determination. They had seen what the invaders did to their towns and families, and they knew there could be no peace, no retreat, only resistance. Every field, forest, and frozen river became a battlefield. The slogan "Not one step back" was not just a command, it was a creed. As winter approached, the balance began to shift. The Germans, exhausted and ill-equipped for the cold, faced an enemy that seemed to grow stronger with every passing week. The Soviet reinforcements kept arriving, clothed in thick coats, fighting with rifles still smelling of fresh oil from the factories. They came by train, by truck, even on foot, forming a living wall that stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea. For the first time since the invasion began, the Red Army was not merely surviving, it was beginning to push back. In Moscow, where panic had once ruled, a new confidence took hold. Stalin appeared in public, addressing the nation, invoking the memory of past Russian heroes who had defended the motherland from foreign invaders. His words, harsh and commanding, carried a strange comfort, the promise that endurance itself was a weapon. Around him, the city transformed into a fortress. Civilians dug trenches in parks and squares, students built barricades, and priests blessed soldiers before they went to the front. By December, as snow blanketed the land, the impossible had happened. The Red Army, battered but unbroken, stood its ground before Moscow. When the German advance finally stalled, it was not only because of the cold or lack of supplies, it was because the Soviet people had refused to yield. Their sheer numbers, their unrelenting will, and their capacity to rebuild amid disaster had stunned the world. The men and women of the Soviet Union had turned defeat into resilience. Their country had been wounded, but not destroyed. The enemy that had believed it could crush them in weeks now found itself trapped in a war without end, facing an opponent whose strength came not from perfection, but from endurance. And from that winter forward, the tide of history began, slowly but decisively, to turn. As the winter of 1941 set in, the nature of the war darkened beyond comprehension. What had begun as a campaign of conquest was transforming into a campaign of annihilation. In the shadows of the front lines, deep inside occupied Poland, the Nazi regime was taking its next, most horrifying step. Under Heinrich Himmler's direction, the machinery of death was no longer limited to bullets and firing squads. The SS sought methods that were faster, more efficient, and more secret. At Auschwitz, experiments began with a substance called Zyklon B, originally a pesticide, now repurposed for murder. It was cold, calculated, and industrial. The shift from mass shootings to gas chambers marked not just a change in tactics, but a descent into moral oblivion. The experiment was chilling in its precision. As men watched through small glass windows as hundreds of prisoners were locked inside sealed rooms. Moments later, the pellets dropped, releasing a deadly cyanide gas. Within minutes, silence replaced the cries. The test, if one could even call it that, was declared successful. From that moment on, the idea of extermination became a logistical problem to be solved, a process to be optimized. Death had become a system. In Berlin, this new phase of policy was cloaked under euphemisms like final solution and special treatment. The language of bureaucracy hid the reality of genocide. The deportation trains grew more frequent. Ghettos were emptied one by one. Women and children were herded onto cattle cars, told they were being resettled, when in truth, they were being sent to die. Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, names that would later define the darkest chapter of human history, began to expand. Blueprints were drawn, construction crews hired, rail networks rerouted, all in service of a single purpose: to erase entire peoples from existence. The soldiers on the Eastern Front did not always see the gas chambers, but they felt the weight of what their nation was becoming. Behind them, the Einsatzgruppen continued their grisly work executing Jews, political prisoners, and anyone deemed undesirable. Villages disappeared overnight. Entire communities that had lived for centuries vanished from maps. Even among the German troops, whispers began to spread. Some were haunted by what they saw. Others hardened their hearts and looked away. The brutality of the war and the ideology driving it had fused into one. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union, battered but unbroken, began to turn the tide. Every day, new soldiers arrived at the front, pushing the Germans further from Moscow. The invincible Wehrmacht, once feared across Europe, now found itself trapped in a freezing wasteland, with dwindling supplies and collapsing morale. What had seemed like a swift campaign was transforming into a nightmare of attrition. And as the Germans stalled, the crimes of their leadership deepened. The failure to defeat the Soviet Union only fueled their rage and their obsession with racial purity. The Nazis blamed their setbacks on everyone but themselves, on imagined conspiracies, on the Jews, on inferior races. The more the war slipped out of their control, the more extreme their cruelty became. By early 1942, the machinery of extermination was in full motion. The Wannsee Conference, held in a villa outside Berlin, put the plan into writing. High-ranking officials sat around a polished table, discussing how to coordinate the murder of millions with chilling calmness. There were charts, schedules, even cost estimates. To them, it was logistics. To humanity, it was horror beyond words. The camps that followed Auschwitz, Birkenau, Belzec, Chelmno were designed not for imprisonment but for erasure. Gas chamber-placed firing squads, crematoria replaced graves. The killing became routine, hidden behind barbed wire and euphemism, mechanized into a rhythm of death that no conscience could justify. And yet, even in the midst of this darkness, there were flickers of humanity that refused to die. Prisoners whispered songs of defiance. Villagers risked their lives to hide strangers. Some German soldiers refused orders, quietly sabotaging the very system they served. Resistance grew in the ghettos, in the forests, in the hearts of those who believed that even against such evil, dignity must endure. The human spirit, though battered and broken, still glowed faintly against the cold machinery of hate. When history would later look back on that time, it would struggle to comprehend how a nation of poets and scientists could descend into such madness. But it would also remember the courage of those who resisted, the few who chose compassion over cruelty, who chose to save instead of destroy. Because even in humanity's darkest hour, there were still those who refused to surrender their souls. The story of that winter, the stalled invasion, the desperate Soviet defense, the birth of industrialized genocide, is not just a chronicle of war. It is a warning. It shows how quickly ambition can become destruction when guided by ideology instead of conscience. It reminds us that the line between civilization and savagery is far thinner than we want to believe. The events of 1941 and 1942 were not inevitable, they were choices made by men who believed their power could rewrite morality. And so, as we remember these moments, we are reminded that history's value lies not only in remembrance but in vigilance. Every act of cruelty, every word of hate, every attempt to divide humanity carries the echo of that time. The past calls to us not to relive its horror, but to ensure it never happens again. If you have stayed with this story until now, thank you for taking the time to listen, to reflect, and to feel. History is not just a collection of dates and battles, it is a mirror of who we are and what we can become. If this journey moved you, if it made you think, I invite you to support the channel by liking this video, sharing it with others, and subscribing for more stories that uncover the truth behind our shared past. Every view, every comment, and every subscription helps keep history alive so that the lessons written in blood and courage will never fade into silence.